Season 3 of the Options Save Lives podcast is brought to you with the support of our presenting sponsor, R Street Institute, and is hosted by Executive Director Jenny Williamson. Today, we want to welcome Gabrielle Loomis-Annett to the Options Save Lives podcast. Gabrielle, thank you so much for agreeing to come onto our podcast today.
Thanks for having me again. I'm happy to be here.
So I want to get started by letting you introduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit about your professional background and how you came to specialize in both traumatic stress and alcohol use disorder.
Sure. Well, it was maybe a little bit of a windy path, I think, as often it can be for folks. But so therapy and counseling is a second career for me. And I went into the field after having just such a profound personal experience with trauma therapy. So when I went into the field, I knew that I wanted to focus on trauma. And so I actually moved, almost completely across the country and went to a school that allowed me to concentrate and focus on that in my master's program. So I did that. And during the program, I realized that that there were a lot of people that didn't know that they had trauma. I think is the best way to explain it. Like, we're all familiar with, combat trauma and things like that, but there are people that have experienced trauma or major stressors and maybe don't realize it. And I just started doing more research, and I kind of did my practicum and substance use. And I went, oh, this is the place where I really feel like I can make an impact. And at the time, there was very little coordination between mental health and substance use. It was in trauma and substance use. They were like these two completely separate things that were treated separately. Fortunately, that's changed in the years, but it's not changed enough. So that really started my passion for really being combining the two. So I'm actually duly licensed both in mental health and in substance use. And I started working in the field and was quickly discouraged and burnt out, as I think most therapists are in traditional treatment, and recognized that the statistics are that traditional treatment has a 2 to 8% success rate, and that really bore itself out in my own personal experience. And it was hard to get up every day and work in such an intensive field when you felt like you weren't even helping or making a difference. And it was right about that time that a colleague approached me, and I had always kind of known him to be kind of on the cutting edge. He worked in the field, and he told me about the Sinclair method and asked me if I knew anything about it, which I didn't. And kind of fast forward, and I ended up being a part of a center that he owned that was specifically about the Sinclair method, outpatient. And really studied under the physician there for, a couple of years, 2-3 years, and learned so much about how to do the Sinclair method properly and all the kind of like potential pitfalls that can happen or the things that people can experience in doing it. And so at that point I was sold. I haven't looked back. And in my concierge counseling practice now, I really specialize in, alcohol use disorder and the Sinclair method, as well as trauma.
Your first reaction to the Sinclair method was positive because of the way you were introduced to it.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit more about how that helped you help facilitate for others to learn the Sinclair method and how to support it? Because you didn't learn about this randomly. A lot of people, even in the therapy world, will learn about it through Claudia's TEDx talk, and then
Sure.
and then they immediately dismiss it. But talk about the power of learning about it from a trusted source.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think it made such a huge difference for me. And then of course, connecting with his partner, who was the physician who had experience with that, was also really helpful, because I felt like I was getting training from, somebody that had been using it and was seeing success. And, I think to your point of, it's dismissed easily. We really have to understand the context of why that is. And that's because of the alcohol use disorder treatment history. Like, we have to understand the history to understand why that keeps happening. And the history is that, substance use and alcohol use was not a medical condition until the last, I don't know, 15 years, I want to say. And I might be a little off on that time frame. But for 100 years, it was this identifiable problem, but not in the medical community. And it was in the religious and spiritual communities that attempted to treat, alcohol use disorder with AA. And so it wasn't designated a medical problem or a medical condition. And that's why there are so many, I think, folks that are so ingrained in that history and ingrained in that treatment approach. And in fact, most treatment centers, again, up until probably 15 years ago, were modeled after a non-medical model for substance use. You would never see that in eating disorder. You would never see that in depression. You would never see that in anxiety. You would never see treatment that was not based on some medical model, but it was in substance use. And so people are just very attached to that history. And thank God it's changing. And thank God, therapists are being trained on harm reduction models and other models. But many therapists were trained that is the model, that is how you treat substance use. And I think that's why we have so many that just dismiss the other models.
Before we get into the meat of our questions, share a little bit about your clinical experience working with the Sinclair method.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I started with the outpatient center, and that was in 2016, I think, is when we started. So about 7 years. And so that center was around for 3 years. And so during that time, I worked closely with, as I mentioned, the medical provider, and their program was therapy as well as the medication for the Sinclair method. There was no option to do one or the other. It was both. And so, as I mentioned, I learned so much about what works and what doesn't work and how to help people succeed with the Sinclair method. I've continued to use it in my own private practice really since then, and make it a point to connect with providers who are aware of, as well as educate providers. I just started working with 2 psychiatrists about 6 months ago. They had never heard of it. And it was such a joy to talk to them about it, educate them about that. They did, in fact, we shared a client and started that client on the program of therapy as well as seeing that provider. Client's doing fantastic, just a complete success story with the Sinclair method. I was able to share with them literature. They've passed it along to all of their colleagues. So, so I just, again, over and over, my experience has been to see how the Sinclair method is successful. And of course, I've worked with clients where it's been unsuccessful. And so I've been able to, really kind of pinpoint what some of those things are where, people struggle.
Going back to the history of therapy and the traditional success rates, many people are coming to the Sinclair method having tried so many different things, and they are a lot of them are very disillusioned, maybe, when it comes to even the thought of speaking to a therapist, because they have been stigmatized, they have felt shamed, they have felt blamed. And so there is a very large resistance within a lot of people, and for good reasons.
Absolutely.
Why they are hesitant to speak with and to use a therapist while they're on the Sinclair method journey, because in some cases, their therapy has actually traumatized them even more. So, can you contextualize why it is so important for someone to come to find that good supportive therapist
Um,
who can help them along with their journey, and why they should give it another shot and look for
mhm.
someone new who will actually support them?
Yeah, for sure. It's such a great question. And I really feel for people who have gotten so discouraged. And to your point, just actually blamed and shamed, in trying to get help. And it's unfortunate that it happens as much as it does. And before I kind of answer the question, I just want to encourage people, like, if they are looking and might be ready to try again, is just right from the beginning, before you even set up an appointment, ask that therapist if they are familiar with harm reduction models. Just ask that right off the bat. And if they say no, then move on. Like, because that's going to just be kind of a clear indicator of at least some of their education and training. But to answer your question, I really do feel it's important. I've worked with a lot of people that have come to me and said they've tried Sinclair on their own and felt like they were not as successful as they wanted to be. And I've seen that change as we have started working together. And I think it's for a couple of reasons. The main reason being that, again, just in my clinical experience, the number one reason why people are unsuccessful with the Sinclair method is their ability to manage stressors and triggers. So many people use alcohol to manage their stressors and their triggers. And even people who don't have an alcohol problem, who don't overdrink, use alcohol to manage stress and triggers, right? We had a long day at the office. Let's open a bottle of wine. It's built into our culture, right? And there's lots of reasons why people do that. The sedating effect on the brain initially. So all of that to say, that's where I think a therapist can be very helpful, is one, in helping a client identify what those stressors and triggers are. And two, then developing alternative coping mechanisms. Because as you're doing the Sinclair journey and you are changing your habits with alcohol, that is essential. Because if you're not managing your stressors and triggers in another way, it's going to continue, your brain and your body are going to continue to point you to alcohol to manage those stressors and triggers. So it has to be a very active process to develop, alternative coping skills. I also think a therapist provides accountability. And, if we look at any type of habit change, if somebody's trying to change their diet, change their relationship with alcohol, start exercising, whatever that habit change is, accountability in the beginning is really key for people to be successful. And I think a therapist can provide that. And then I also think a therapist, now, one who is not TSM trained might not be able to do this, but in terms of TSM specific, but another thing that a therapist can do is help somebody with their goals, and using SMART goals, which is an acronym. And I think that that's another reason why people, I've seen people be unsuccessful or give up on the Sinclair, is they think in week 2, they're going to be at their goal. And they don't have realistic, realistic goals. And I think a therapist can help somebody with their goals in general for habit change. And then, of course, if, you have a therapist that's familiar with TSM, they can actually really help with those specific goals. So I think those are the ways a therapist can be helpful.
I want to key in on your comments about goals and expectations. We see this so much even in the peer support groups where people have unrealistic
Mhm.
expectations.
Yeah.
How much of that do you feel is coming from the traditional treatment mindset? Because in an abstinence only modality, every abstinent day is perfect success. And the Sinclair method with and many harm reduction models operate in more of a gray area where success is not quite so easy to define. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's good. It's a good point. And again, I think, when we look at the success rates of abstinence-based programs, the success rates the first 30 days when somebody is inpatient, well, that's 100%. Everybody's abstinent. But then once they leave, that's when, long-term success rates drop to less than 10%. And, the reason being is that for me, how I see it is alcohol, when we're using it to cope, then removing the alcohol leaves untreated, whatever that may be, untreated anxiety, untreated trauma, untreated depression. Maybe somebody's in an unhealthy, toxic relationship. So those things, those deeper issues that are underneath the alcohol use take time to really sort out and take time to, develop healthy coping mechanisms and, make healthy choices. And that's kind of how I explain it to people, is like, alcohol really isn't the problem. It's the symptom of the problem. And there's great relief, of course, in starting TSM and, in the initial kind of phases and seeing, some changes there, but ultimately it's all of the root causes that are what need to be addressed. And I kind of, just phrase it that way. And again, I think, those are the areas that a therapist can be really helpful with. And, for people who are looking for that immediate, immediate success, I think that's also where being familiar, having a therapist that's familiar with TSM can help them see the success they are having, and that first, I kind of break the Sinclair journey into 3 phases. And for me, that first phase is just all about being compliant with the protocol, nothing else. And, I can then help people, track and see that if they're doing that every day, that they took the pill before they drank, every day they waited 60 minutes, every day they stopped drinking when the window closed, every day that they do that is success. And that is the equivalent to the abstinent, having a day sober, is kind of how I look at it.
I'd love to continue to explore this line, compliancy being the first. What are your other 2 phases
Sure.
that you break this
and
down into?
I'm really clear with people. There's nothing else to do in that first phase. And if you try to do something else, then it is, it's not following well, let me rephrase that. It's potentially setting yourself up for disappointment and potentially trying to rush the process and set yourself up to have a setback. So now, again, because I'm also, a mental health counselor, then there's the mental health goals in that first phase, which is identifying triggers, which is starting to develop healthy coping skills, which is, getting proper assessments to really understand the bigger picture, history assessments, things like that. All of those things are kind of happening in that first phase. But, that first 3 to 6 months, depending on the person, to me, it's all just compliance. Until the compliance is second nature, it's not even something you think about. You've adjusted your routine, you've adjusted your schedule, so that it's easy and it's comfortable.
Your recovery journey is uniquely yours. When you have questions or need guidance reaching your goals, there's a TSM coach for you at Your Sinclair Method Coaching. Book a coaching session today.
And then the second phase is where we start to implement those SMART goals, and we start to actually create goals around quantity, frequency, habit change, and we start to implement them. And they're again using that SMART framework. They're small, measurable, attainable goals, right? Again, where I see what happens so often is people reduce their quantity way too quickly. And it may be okay for the first couple of days or first couple of weeks, but then their cravings really increase after that. So we do very small, measurable, attainable goals. And that next 3 to 6 months is the actual reduction, but using, small steps to attain that, right? And at this point now they're having, an even bigger toolbox of coping skills, right? Better able to handle triggers and things that come up. And so continuing to really fine tune all of that as well. And then I sort of see phase 3 as maintenance. So somebody's reached their goal. And then what does that look like in terms of Sinclair for maintenance here, here on out? And then that's where I begin like trauma processing. So like deeper kind of trauma work we'll do once somebody has kind of reached their goal or in their maintenance. And what I find is that people's goals change. I know this, people, it's a relationship with alcohol. It changes over time. It changes as things in your life change. And so that maintenance may not be just at the same point from here on out.
Honestly, I love that you have broken this down into going into that trauma in that third maintenance. Can you talk about the rationale behind waiting until that maintenance time to dig into the trauma as opposed to trying to start tackling trauma day one on the Sinclair method?
Yeah. Well, and let me kind of clarify, because there is some nuance to this, is that we are starting with trauma therapy from day one. We're not starting with trauma processing. That's the difference. And I think that's what people oftentimes get confused. Like they think trauma therapy is processing trauma, going into the memories, talking about trauma on that very kind of intense level. And actually, trauma therapy is multiphasic as well. And I was trained in the triphasic model, but even therapies like EMDR, they have 8 phases. There's 8 phases to EMDR. It's not one, right? So the beginning is very similar to kind of what I was talking about in terms of I'm assessing what somebody's trauma is. And because oftentimes people don't either identify that they have trauma, or it's like, that was so long ago and I don't have memories and I don't think this applies to me. But I have all of these really kind of cool, handy assessments that help us see, including one that's about trauma symptoms. Doesn't ask you about anything that you experienced. It just assesses your symptoms. And so those first 2 phases, when somebody is in Sinclair, is we're really getting a handle on what is it that we want to address on a deeper level. Doing assessments, doing history, identifying patterns, identifying triggers, and a lot of sort of education. And then we're also learning how to cope with all of that. And in any model of working with trauma, you have to do all of that before you process. Because otherwise you're potentially destabilizing somebody. You're opening up, something that they're not prepared to deal with. And I think it syncs up so nicely with the Sinclair. And again, this has taken me years to kind of really put this into practice, is that by the time somebody's at their goal with the Sinclair, they've had enough experience that they're not going to continue to reach for alcohol when they're dealing with something that may be highly stressful. And when they may have temporary, experiences in doing trauma processing where they feel activated, right? So, and if you're doing trauma processing before somebody gets to that point, then you're risking that they're going to continue to overdrink, because that's what their brain knows. That's what their brain's going to tell them to do. So we need all of this time to develop new habits, new awareness, new coping skills before we go into that deeper work.
So safe to say, if I were to recap that briefly, that first you figure out what the issue is, then
Yes.
you build the toolbox as fully as you can, and then you go to work.
Perfect. Yes. Perfect. It's like actually get a correct diagnosis. What is really going on, right? Because most people, it's just like, well, I just drink too much. Again, that's the tip of the surface, right? Like it's what's going on underneath. So get that proper kind of assessment diagnosis, get the toolbox, then we can kind of, jump in and do some deeper work.
And of course, when it comes to trauma and addiction, it can go in multiple different ways. You can have people who develop addiction because they have had trauma in their life.
Right.
And you can have people who go through traumas because of their addiction. And so how does that conversation usually go as you're trying to help someone figure out whether or to recognize the traumas that they may have had in the past that help lead to this, that maybe they have self-invalidated their feelings over the trauma versus the trauma that they are continuing to inflict on themselves through the addiction that they may not be able to identify as trauma in the real and now time.
Yeah, because it's really this kind of vicious cycle, right? It's, trauma creating over drinking, then over drinking creating more trauma, which creates more over drink. It's just this kind of vicious cycle. And I do a lot of education, right? And sharing resources and, books and things that people can read to really educate themselves. But we kind of talk about two different types of traumas. So there's what we call big T traumas, and then there's what we call little T traumas. So the last completely sort of randomized poll that they did of Americans off the New York subway was like 15 years ago. It was quite a while ago, maybe even 20. And at that point, 76% of Americans stated they had experienced one or more traumas. So the reality is 100% of people have experienced trauma. There's no way to be in this world and to escape any trauma whatsoever. And that includes, all the things that we think of, when we think of trauma. But it also includes things like natural disasters. It includes things like divorce, like loss. Like these are all things that, psychologists know are challenging to cope with and affect a person significantly. So I kind of start there, right? With what people are aware of. And then we kind of go on and do, again, a lot of history taking and a lot of assessment to see, are there some lasting effects from little T traumas? So these are traumas that maybe in and of themselves, they do not impact somebody significantly. But if there's enough of them, if you have 3 little T traumas all happening at the same time, the brain and body responds in a big T trauma way, right? In traumatic stress way. And so we kind of go through those as well. And, and I think the other thing is really important for people to understand, trauma is not about what happened to you. It's what your brain and body did in that experience. And so, yes, we understand and we know that there are certain things that everybody's going to be traumatized by. But this is where, working with a trauma therapist is so helpful, because it's helping them see if their brain and body is reacting in traumatic stress, regardless of what occurred. Whatever happened is less important. What's more important is, how is your brain and body functioning? What are the patterns of your thoughts, your emotions, your behaviors, your physical symptoms? If you're in traumatic stress, then we just have to deal with that, whether or not we think we should be. right? Whether or not we think something significant happened to put us there, if it's happening, we got to deal with it.
What you're saying, and I know this is going to be obvious to you, but just in case it's not for anybody listening, traumatic stress is not something you can logic your way out of.
Correct. Correct. And we've all been taught that we can in some, indirect or direct way. And that's such a harmful message that all of us received, because the brain doesn't work that way. There's 3 parts to the brain. There's the brain stem, that controls all of our functioning, our bodily functioning. This is because we don't have to, this is why we don't have to tell ourselves to like digest that food and, breathe, because all of that happens automatically. Then there's the emotional brain, and then there's the logical brain. The emotional brain is 9 times the size of the logic brain. It operates in a completely different ways than the logical brain does. And it is hardwired in traumatic stress to override the logical brain. Because when you are, I actually had this happen fairly recently when I was hiking and I saw something in the path ahead of me. And before I could figure out what it was, my limbic system, my emotional brain, my, reptilian brain took over, and I started, running the other direction. And I got maybe 10 feet, and sure enough, it was a 10-foot snake in the path. If my logic brain was in charge in that moment, I would have walked closer to investigate, and I would have gotten bit. But the limbic system engaged, and this is how we are all hardwired. There's no way around it. This is hardwiring. The limbic system engaged. And so when that happens, and that's what traumatic stress comes from, the limbic system being engaged in fight, flight, or freeze, traumatic stress response. There is no, you can't logic yourself out of it. It's more powerful, and it's designed to override your logic. Does that make sense?
It does. And then I want to just kind of continue this a little bit from the sense of trying to destigmatize and de-shame. Everything that you are saying is that this is set up to protect us.
Yes.
So when someone is feeling these trauma responses, this is not something to be ashamed of. And so talk a little bit more about that, of why there is a benefit to this and how you learn to rein this back to
Sure.
something that is healthy and a productive way of dealing with it.
Yes. And, our hardwiring was developed through our evolution when, we were running from bears, right? And we needed to have, this system engage in a second to protect us and to override, and so that we would just react, right? And unfortunately, it really hasn't updated as modern life has updated. That's the challenge, right? And so now, for many people, the bear is now their phone going off, 18,000 times a day, buzzing. It's their traffic. It's, challenging meetings with clients or bosses or coworkers that keep triggering that system, right? As if it's a bear. And so to take away the stigma, this is just our hardwiring. This is really kind of old sort of hardwiring that hasn't, our genetics haven't updated. It is there to protect us. And while we can't just think our way out of it and say, oh, stop responding in that way, it's not that simple. We can engage our logical brain in other ways to help us turn that system off, as well as other tools that really are designed to to kind of work on the somatic level, to work on the physical level, to work on the nervous system level. And all of those tools really help with turning that stress response off. And then there are some people where what is actually triggering the stress response is that prior trauma. So that's the other component that a lot of people may not understand, is that you may have put that away in your mind. In your mind, it's compartmentalized. It's in a spot right here. You don't ever think about it. However, it can still be activating the limbic system. It can still be triggering that stress response, even though in your mind you think it's put away. And so for folks that is the case, which again, this is all part of what, I help sort of somebody figure out, you really have to process that trauma to get it to stop triggering the traumatic stress response. And the way our brain works is it looks for current circumstances that have some link or some match to that prior trauma. And then once it finds it, it activates that prior trauma. And then we're in the traumatic stress response. So an example could be, let's say somebody kind of grew up with a dad that yelled. So then you have a difficult meeting with your boss who's a male, and he's kind of raises his voice, right? Not really yelling, but maybe gets animated, raises his voice. Your brain goes, oh, wait, I know what that is. I need to protect myself. I need to trigger this traumatic stress response. And when that happens, then we have to ultimately process that original material in order to not be triggered in the present.
A lot of traditional recovery focuses on willpower and strength and like forcing yourself through things. And yet the Sinclair method, and to a large part, trauma and dealing with trauma, really relies on resilience instead.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about the differences between trying to will yourself through addiction or a traumatic response versus learning resilience, which we know can be learned, which is also a wonderful thing. So if someone doesn't feel resilient, there are ways they can change that. So why don't you talk about the difference between those two mentalities of tackling the addiction and trauma responses?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, I'm pretty vocal about, the shortcomings of the traditional model, because I've just seen, too many people suffer and people not get better. And, one of the shortcomings is, if you just stop the problematic substance, then everything's fine. And you just have to willpower yourself through it. Well, what ends up happening is you have people walking around with untreated PTSD, untreated depression, untreated anxiety, whatever the thing is. And then trying to willpower themselves through that. And we would never say to a diabetic, well, you need to willpower yourself and get your insulin down. You need to willpower and just kind of tough it out as the only thing that you do. We say, hey, it's a combination of things. It's habit change. It's, yes, having, the resolve and the accountability and the support to make changes. But it isn't, feeling like you're just hanging on and just trying to get through the next moment, because that's not true change, right? That's suffering. And that's what I've seen thousands of people go through, is just utter suffering. And then eventually, they just can't do that any longer. So, resilience is about having the tools, the knowledge, and the support and the commitment to continue to make progress and to move forward. Like, that's what resiliency, I think resiliency is, right? it is an inner strength, but that inner strength comes from having all of those things. It's not doing it alone. Human beings were never meant to be alone. We were never meant to go through difficult things alone. We are hardwired for connection, right? So it's having support, it's having connection, it's being able to talk about things. We know from research that when people go through natural disasters and it's a community event and people talk about it, they are less traumatized for that reason alone. Is when people are not alone and they talk about it, it impacts them less significantly. So when we have things like community and support and we talk about things, we build resiliency. When we develop skills to be able to handle our emotions, we develop resiliency. When we make a commitment to ourselves not to be perfect, but to make progress, we build resiliency. And that's what I love so much about the Sinclair method, is it really is tapping into those tenets, which, as you said, are also the same tenets that are really important in trauma therapy. And, you know, there's the no pain, no gain is not something that works when it comes to mental health. It doesn't work substance use, and it certainly doesn't work in trauma therapy. Like, the more painful it is, then the more people regress, right? So I think that I think really resiliency is a great word to describe, you know, what the Sinclair method can do.
And then just to go ahead and wrap things up, so hopefully we have laid out a lot of really good reasons why someone should consider a TSM supportive therapist at some point in their journey. If they're able to come in right away, that's wonderful. If they need to work themselves up to that, that's also wonderful. It's not when you start, it's that you do.
Yeah.
But one question that I do want to have you answer, because there is a very large black hole when it comes to TSM knowledgeable therapists right now. It's nowhere near as widespread as TSM medical providers. What is the difference between someone who is TSM friendly as a therapist and a TSM informed therapist?
Yes. I think there is a difference, and I think both are great. What the difference is, a TSM friendly therapist is a therapist who has some experience and some training in harm reduction models. So they may not know TSM specifically, but they're familiar with, you know, the overall MAT, medication assisted treatment umbrella. And they have some experience with that. They have some knowledge with that. And therefore are supportive of somebody doing a harm reduction model, right? And, you know, I think that there are more and more, as I would call them, TSM friendly therapists. Again, they may have never heard of TSM, but they're harm reduction. They're aware of harm reduction. They're supportive of that. And I think that's great. And I think that that's probably the majority of therapists. In terms of, you know, the two different types of therapists, the majority are going to be TSM friendly, because while TSM is not taught in school, harm reduction models now are. So anyway, so I think that's a TSM friendly therapist. And they are, you know, going to be supportive of, and if somebody's working with a coach or has their TSM medical provider, I think all of that can be, you know, very helpful to have kind of coordinated care. And again, they may not be able to help with the TSM phases, but they can certainly be supportive and healthy habits and coping skills and all of those things that I mentioned previously. And then a TSM trained therapist is somebody that's gone through, you know, the C3 Foundation training, or like myself, has worked with a provider and, you know, received training from that provider. And that's somebody that can really be sort of a TSM coach and a therapist all in one. And I wish there were more of us. And I hope that continues, it continues to grow. I feel like I'm, trying to champion, in my field, and other therapists I know to do that. But, that's somebody that really can kind of guide you through the ins and outs of TSM and the therapy side of it as well.
Do you have a preferred or good resource if someone, because like I said, as much as I wish we had more people listed on therapists on our website, there's still a black hole in that area. There's probably only 5 or 6 of you, I believe,
in the whole country.
Yeah. And so where would someone go to look for we'll just say a harm reduction or TSM friendly therapist in their area? Where would somebody even go to look for that information?
So I think Psychology Today is the best resource. It's it allows you to search, by so many different criteria, including, what issues therapists treat. So there's not a harm reduction button or field, but there is substance use. And then, as I mentioned previously, that can be followed up, with an email inquiry, asking them what models, what approaches do they use with substance use or alcohol use. So I think that's probably people's best bet. I also think if you have a TSM provider, ask them if they know of therapists, in their area or that they've worked with that they know are TSM friendly.
And that's great advice. Thank you so much for spending the time with us today and sharing your insight. I hope everyone has truly gotten some great pointers out of listening to this episode.
Great. Thanks so much, Jenny. I always appreciate talking with you and just being able to share more about the Sinclair method.
This TSM Quick Tip is brought to you by the C3 Foundation with support from our sponsor, Alcure.
Medication adherence is so important on the Sinclair method. Without it, you cannot be successful. So what do you tell your clients to help them?
3 things. Number 1, I suggest they get a keychain pill holder.
Excellent.
Right on their car keys or their house keys so that they have a pill with them at all times. Number 2 is I have them set an alarm for an hour before they think they're about to start drinking. And they set a second alarm, number 3, for when that hour is up and they can start drinking.
Great idea. So an alarm for when you take your naltrexone, an alarm when the hour's up, and always have your medication on you so you can stick to medication adherence, which is the key to success on TSM.